Thank you, Mr. President, and I want to thank the Oxford Union for inviting me here tonight. It's a real pleasure to follow on from Chloe Glynn, who, despite losing that coin toss, did an admirable job of putting forward the case of the opposition. But I will say, speaking about relics in the room is no way to talk about her fellow teammates. Now, before I get into the meat of my argument, I want to just go back to the motion. It is that this House would prioritise economic equality over economic growth. Now, I'm not going to argue that growth is bad or even that it's not important, nor am I going to argue that the end goal should be economic equality, despite, of course, being a socialist. Because all that is required to support this motion is a recognition that reducing economic inequality in our society is an important and pressing aim, more important and pressing than the goal of pure economic growth measured by increases in GDP, and is therefore worthy of prioritisation above it. That's what I aim to convince you of. The fact that we live in a highly unequal society is obvious to me, as I'm sure it is to you. I represent Nottingham East. My city is the 11th most deprived of 317 districts in England, and we have one of the lowest rates of disposable income in the country. I've had people turn up to my constituency office who have not eaten a hot meal in days. I've witnessed parents break down in tears as they cannot afford to provide for their children. I've spoken to constituents who've worked their whole lives but have just pennies in their savings accounts. Anywhere in the world, these kind of situations would be heartbreaking. But what makes this particularly unjust, particularly cruel, particularly sickening, is that this is happening here in the 6th largest economy in the world. Is the opposition really saying that there is nothing we can do to right these wrongs now, that we have to wait for our economy to grow before we can tackle the poverty that is ruining the lives of millions of people today? We should reject that entirely. The failure to tackle economic inequality is a political choice. We're already a wealthy country, but wealth is not evenly distributed. Instead, it's concentrated in the hands of a privileged few. Because Britain's a great place to be rich. The richest 10% of households have incomes among the highest in Europe. But if you're working class, or even if you're middle class, the truth is that you'd often be better off elsewhere. Middle-income British households are 9% poorer than their counterparts in France, while the poorest fifth would be 20% richer in Germany. So to prioritise economic equality would be to act in the interest not just of the most marginalised, but also average income households that are getting poorer and poorer through no fault of their own. No, thank you. Now, the opposition argues that this is a noble aim, but prioritising equality is not the way to alleviate poverty or falling incomes. They claim that a rising tide lifts all boats, that growth in GDP would bring increasing wealth and higher living standards to all sections of society, even that equality is necessary so that the rich have capital to invest in job creation. Well, you'll forgive me if I'm sceptical of their economic predictions, given that Mr. Bone once argued that the introduction of the minimum wage would, and I quote, condemn hundreds of thousands to the dole queue. In recent decades, while the rising tide may have lifted the billionaires' yachts, smaller boats have been dashed on the rocks, and Nottingham knows this better than most places. Our level of productivity is close to the national average, yet our household incomes are amongst the lowest in the country. An increase in GDP means little to the income of a disabled person reliant on benefits that this government refuses to raise. It would not lift the wages of a worker in an ununionised workplace with bosses who refuse to pass on to their staff their bumper profits. And it would not improve anyone's living standards if the gains of growth go straight into offshore bank accounts. GDP just isn't an adequate measure of what matters to people. Its rise alone does little to make the majority of people's lives better. And the UK is a poster child for this. Over the last decade, GDP has risen, but has that led to higher incomes? No. Most people are worse off than they were in 2008. I was 11 in 2008. Some of you, I'm sure, were much younger. And now, no. I take the point that you were much younger. And now, while this country battles a cost of living crisis, the rich continue to cash in while most working people lose out. So last year, incomes for the poorest 14 million people fell by 7.5%, while the richest fifth saw theirs increase by 7.8%. It's clear that without intervention, without prioritising tackling this gaping inequality and redistributing wealth, this situation will only worsen. And this brings me to another group that I'm proud to represent. At 26 years old, I'm the UK's youngest MP, and alongside most of this room, I'm a member of a generation that will be poorer than our parents. A generation that spends half our income renting ex-council flats that our landlords bought in the 1980s with the spare change they found down the back of their sofa, our wages now lining their pockets as they hoard more and more housing. Because while the media decries our spending habits, it's not avocado toast or Netflix subscriptions that is to blame for our lack of financial security. High levels of economic inequality means our social contract is broken. The value of assets continues to grow, while wages do not. It makes people's life chances even more dependent on the assets of their parents, with wealth passed down from generation to generation. It means no matter how hard we work, buying a house or achieving a comfortable standard of living is increasingly out of reach for so many of us. Never mind closing the gap between on the wealthiest as they hoover up yet more property in an ever more vicious cycle. Because extreme wealth in our society is rarely earned, it's gained through a combination of luck, inheritance, rent-seeking, and exploitation. We should feel no qualms redistributing what has not come through hard work, but far too often has been stolen from wages and through tax avoidance, which is not invested back into our economy, but squirreled in tax havens or fueling our housing crisis. Evidence suggests that the level of inequality we have is even hurting the economic growth that the opposition argues is so important. In fact, the International Monetary Fund, yes, those notorious Marxists at the IMF, now consider that high levels of inequality can be detrimental to economic stability and for sustained long-term growth. And that's because inequality leads to weaker demand and lower consumption, as those kept at the bottom struggle to even afford the basic essentials. It wastes opportunity and talent, as kids growing up in poverty don't realise their full potential as adults. And also, highly unequal societies are less likely to invest in public infrastructure and more likely to have economic policies that benefit the finance sector at the expense of more productive parts of our economy, which of course can in turn discourage private investments. The IMF believes that policies can be designed to tackle inequality without negative repercussions for growth. Policies that aim to reduce economic inequality could include increasing the minimum wage and benefits for those who can't work, lifting anti-trade union laws to strengthen workers' ability to negotiate for higher pay, taxing and redistributing wealth, such as through increasing capital gains tax and using the funds to finance public investment that benefits all of us. By voting for this motion tonight, you will not be sacrificing economic growth. You will simply be agreeing that a situation where the fruits of productivity do not benefit working people is intolerable, that we cannot continue to live in a society where billionaires' bank balances swell at the same rate as food bank queues, that the government has condemned people to poverty and could take action right now to alleviate it. If you agree with those points, vote with the ayes tonight.